From the minute we saw the game, we couldn't stop playing. We knew we had something, but no one knew just how big it was going to become.
The story of Worms begins with a little-known company called 17-Bit Software, who was a small distribution label of sorts that would put out what are essentially demo compilations on the Amiga to a small but dedicated and growing following. Before the days of the internet, this was one of the ways that small independent game developers would get their creations out to a larger audience, with 17-Bit Software charging a couple of quid per release. The story of Worms also begins with a young girl called Debbie Bestwick, who was an avid gamer growing up playing all of the usual hits like Space Invaders, Pac-Man, and by the time her teens rolled around, Football Manager games on the ZX Spectrum. As her love for gaming grew, she ended up leaving school and working in an independent game shop, and by the time the mid to late 80s had rolled around, she had become the manager. And this is where our two stories meet. You see, 17-Bit Software had grown a little. Actually, they had grown quite a bit. So much so that several games that they had put out were exclusive games to these demo compilations, essentially making them full-blown publishers by this point. Which turned out to be a pretty decent move because Michael Robinson, one of the founders of 17-Bit, was also the owner of several retail stores called Microbyte, where of course they sold these compilations. Eventually the game shop that Debbie ran was also taken over by Microbyte, leaving only one final piece to the puzzle, and that was of course the small group of bedroom coders that had all worked within 17-Bit in the past and were now as one, kind of a dream team if you will, and that dream team was known as Team 7. Ah, Team 7. They made some okay games. You got the Miami Vice inspired Miami Chase, which was again, it was okay, nothing too special, but hey, it was the small team's first collaborative effort, so we won't go too hard on it. After all, the important part of this story isn't this game that was published by Codemasters. It was the collaboration effort of 17-Bit Software and Team 7 that would merge together and ultimately become Team 17. One of the UK's earliest major success stories, an Amiga-focused development company that released hits such as Alien Breed, which, of course, really put them on the map. Project X, Super Frog, Body Blows, Arcade Pool, a whole heap of sequels and plenty more. Within the world of Amiga home computing, Team 17 were a recognisable name and logo, and they still continued to publish some incredible games like Apidia, Super Stardust and Assassin. In short, if you had an Amiga, it's almost certain that you had some Team 17 floppies lying around, as these success stories continued into the early 90s. However, as the Amiga scene slowly started to die, with only the real hardcore staying behind, and of course by 1995 that hardcore scene was more than certainly pretty clued up with how to pirate anything they wanted, the 16-bit home console fight was coming to an end, and the PlayStation, well, that was already out in Japan. It was of course time for Team 17 to move into ventures new. Sure, they had dabbled with MS-DOS, CD32 and, well, not a whole lot else. Team 17 needed to get their software onto different systems and they needed a new game to show off what they could do. A game that's not just as good as Alien Breed, without a doubt still the most popular IP that they had under their belt, but they needed a game, or preferably a game series, that was easily adaptable to everything. And luckily for them, they found what they were looking for when a young lad rocked up to their stand at the 1994 European Computer Trade Show with a floppy disk in hand. They booted it up and Total Wormage, later renamed to simply Worms, was born. And the rest, as they say, is history. A history that we're going to be exploring today, as we go back to the beginning and look into this game franchise and find out how it came to be in the first place. We're going to look at its creation, its constant change-ups, the massive amounts of sequels, and of course, the complete history of Worms. Welcome to Slope's Game Room. Our story starts in the UK, back in the early years of the 1990s, when one fidgety young student in a maths class in a random Bournemouth school was asked by his equally fidgety friend, "I bet you can't make a game for that," that being a Casio graph plotting calculator, to which fidgety lad number 1 accepted the offer. Andy Davidson was that lad, and after a short while he did it. He coded a small artillery game called Artillery, similar to the ones he used to play on the Commodore 64. You know, the ones where you've got 2 static tank-like figures on each side of the screen, and you need to carefully aim your weaponry, measure the strength of your shot, and of course, take the force of the wind into account. Last one standing wins. In an interview with Andy, he says he doesn't exactly remember how he got a game like this running on a calculator. But what he does remember was that maths was just simply that boring, and therefore he just cracked on and got it done. Eventually he got himself an Amiga to continue to work on his military-inspired game, with that system adding several elements that made it more unique, like bottomless water pits and of course changing the tank-like sprites to lemmings. Yep. Before Worms, it was these little blue-jumpered / green-haired lemmings that would duke it out against one another. As much as Andy liked the gameplay of tanks, the look and feel of the sprites by the early 90s standard was simply boring.
I always thought it would be better to have little properly controllable things which you could move around.
And what better controllable little things than lemmings? They worked perfectly, just like everyone for the time. Andy was amazed at just how much detail was packed into these tiny little sprites, and so he swapped them out for this game. And before you know it, his little artillery game was no longer made just to impress his classmates, but now the entire school.
It ended up getting banned from the school. People were skipping lessons just to come and play it. I sort of took over a whole corner of the art room, and you'd hear things exploding and making strange noises. And my form tutor said, "Andy, you are completely disrupting everything. I never want to see that game in school again."
Of course, the game had spread so much by this point that no matter how much his teachers tried to stop it, they couldn't. It was obvious that the game was destined for a wider audience. So, after he finished school, he too got himself a job at a computer shop where he would use the Blitz basic programming language to further enhance the game, taking out the Lemmings characters and then replacing them with Worms. But why Worms? Well, that's obvious. Okay. As stated, the Lemmings were a perfect fit. These tiny 8x8 pixel sprites, for the most part, held so much fluid animation that no matter how far away you were or how many of them were on the screen, you could instantly tell what each one of them was doing at any given time.
Back then, they were just about the only type of creature that hadn't been in a game. Now, this was pre-Earthworm Jim, of course. I wanted something more interesting than tanks or soldiers, and they also suited the small size required, as I was going to have up to 16 of them in play. The public also had a right to know about the more violent side of a worm's nature, which had so far gone unreported by the media in general.
While at the shop, he would constantly have customers come in to play test the game, and once again, when he started getting dads who wouldn't normally play games get into trouble by their better halves for playing what was now total wormage for 2 hours straight, he knew he had something special. In order to get the game in front of as many people's eyes as possible, Andy sent Total Wormage into the Amiga format competition, which is a popular magazine for the time for Amiga enthusiasts. However, not only did it not win, from my research, I don't think it was even mentioned. Being someone that was unwilling to give up, Andy then began shopping his game around to different studios, looking for a publisher, but it was at the previously mentioned 1994 European Computer Trade Show where he went directly to Team 17's booth, and after 5 minutes of playtime, according to Andy,
they said, "Do you want it published?" That was quite a good day.
I bet it was. The marriage between Andy and Team 17 was absolutely perfect, as Team 17 held the Amiga flag higher and longer than the majority of other publishers, which is probably why the majority of other publishers had turned down Andy's Total Wormage game. Remember, this was back when the world of 3D graphics was pretty much already here. The days of bedroom coders wasn't exactly dead, but from this point, for the longest time, they were definitely on their way out. Andy was one of the final major success stories before indie games started making their way back into the mainstream once again. Team 17 knew they had a hit on their hands, and after meeting up with Andy once again at a pub, they exchanged information, went back to their offices, and they lost the contact information, forcing them to get hold of Amiga Power to get them again, and finally the contract was signed and the fine-tuning on Total Wormage went underway. Before continuing on with the video, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for watching this far. As you can imagine, we got lots of games to cover. It's taken months to create this video, so if you like it, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss out on future videos. If that's not for you, simply leaving a comment or even hitting the like button tells YouTube that yes, people like this sort of content, and it's likely that other people will too. Again, a massive thank you for watching for as long as you have. If you want to go the extra mile, then signing up to become a Patreon is the way to do that. Patrons get exclusive access to the Password Zone, which is filled up with videos without all of this stuff and sponsorships, along with probably 1,000 other videos. And finally, before continuing on, I just wanted to let you all know that I have officially partnered up with Pixel Empire, the new official home for Slopes Game Room apparel, including the uber limited edition Slopes Game Room t-shirt that's inspired by this very video. Apparently this is only going to be live for about a month before going into the Slopes crate and probably never being seen again, so make sure to use code SLOPES10 for 10% off, and Patreons and YouTube members, keep an eye out for your extra exclusive coupon. Anyway, once again, thank you guys for all your support, but for now, let's get back into the video.
Worms, the computer game.
Released originally on the Amiga on November 17th, 1995, Worms, as it was renamed for simplicity's sake, is a 2D artillery simulator that requires you to look after 4 pixelated invertebrates, and by using a large arsenal of weapons, take down the opposing 4 hellmimps in a turn-based fashion. That's the basics of it. Heck, the original didn't even have a story, it's just this. Worms played in a typical skirmish-like fashion, possibly in multiplayer, or both combined. But as you all well know, like all classic arcade games, it's the simplicity that captures people. It's easy to play, but hard to master. It may not sound like it had much under the hood, but with its ever-changing terrain and the ability to move about on the playfield by ninja roping up or digging deep and burrowing underground, it all adds up and makes Worms the perfect party game for all types of gamers.
The aim was to create something where every game was different, hence the importance of the random landscape generator. I think this is one of the factors that set it apart from most commercial games. It was never intended to have an end. I also tried to make it more of a social game than most. I wanted to actively encourage people to take the piss out of each other and to wind up their opponents.
The game was remade from the ground up. It included elements that Andy simply just couldn't have done as well on his own, such as the art and the music, but most importantly, it was still very much his game. It was total wormage underneath, but now with the ever-brilliant Team 17 flair on top. During production, not long before release, Andy told Team 17 how he had entered the game into a competition. This left the developer pretty damn scared, as the rules of the competition stated that all demos sent in would be owned by the magazine. Team 17 quickly called them up and asked for the full rights back just before it came out and just before it became a worldwide phenomenon. Okay, lesson learned. In order to get the game in front of as many people as possible, Team 17 put the game onto as many systems as possible. The Amiga and DOS games are by far the most well remembered, being looked after in-house along with the PlayStation release, whilst multiple conversions to consoles from the previous generations were ported elsewhere. Team 17 had finally got their winning game, and a game that was adaptable to pretty much everything. And the further it spread, the more iconic the Worms IP became. Which, by the way, Team 17 really struggled to get released onto the PlayStation, as Sony was supposedly quite anti-non-3D games at that time in America. Thankfully, they had publisher Ocean involved, helping with situations like this. Team 17 decided to only put themselves down as the developer for this first entry, simply because they found it to be the easiest way to get their game onto consoles that they had previously not explored themselves. This allowed them to focus more on the game side of things, which suited Andy and then some. His focus was always just on making the games, which is why he instantly started working on the expansion, Worms Reinforcements. An expansion that brought with it a whole bucket load of extras, including a much needed challenge mode, a few extra terrains, and several little updates to the game that had become the norm for the games moving forward, including timed mines, booby-trapped crates, and the all-important increase in retreat time. This was when I got into Worms. I can literally remember going to PC World with my family, my sisters picking up the Aladdin Activity Centre, and I picked up Worms and Worms Reinforcements. That iconic artwork was just so appealing. I love that artwork so much. I wasn't the biggest PC gamer at the time. I spent way more time on my consoles, but like my small but still growing RTS collection, Worms felt right at home for me on my Gateway 2000 PC. And I spent countless hours messing around with the voices and the gravestone customizations, playing this game way past my bedtime. And it turns out that Andy wasn't done, as Worms: The Director's Cut came out only 1 year after the first expansion in 1997. Now, I didn't know that this game existed until many years later, primarily because it was exclusive to the Amiga. Yet again, the game uses the same engine, and it's essentially Reinforcements Part 2, or Worms 1.5. Your choice. Either way, it's definitely not Worms 2.
I am testing some of the weapons out in this version that will no doubt appear in Worms 2, but what I'm trying to do here is make the best Amiga game ever. It will also be the best version of the original Worms available on any platform.
The game uses Amiga Advanced Graphics Architecture, meaning that it's able to push the original by quite a way. 14 new Worms got included, a level editor, several new backgrounds and terrains. It was simply the perfect send-off for Amiga fans, being one of the system's final major releases, getting fantastic reviews across the board. Worms: The Director's Cut was simply awesome, as it was the game that introduced us to the Concrete Donkey. A staple for the Worms series these days, as you well know. However, what you may not know is that the Concrete Donkey actually exists in real life. This is the real Concrete Donkey, an ornament from his parents' garden that they convinced him as a lad was actually a real donkey covered in cement for their own amusement. This gave Andy nightmares as a kid, and obviously scared him enough to eventually end up in this game. Anyway, that's the end of the original Worms. Many people, including my own, first proper introduction into the pixelated awesomeness that was this game franchise. With its iconic music, its wacky intro sequences, and endless amounts of hours put into it, it's great to see how much this game has evolved in this original entry and its 2 updated releases. Platforming by this point had become incredibly important to the franchise, and multiplayer is easier than ever, but still not as easy as it could be. Worms 2 wasn't a secret. Team 17 were talking about its development before even Reinforcements came out. The plan was to originally make a game like Reinforcements as the sequel, but Andy was opposed to the idea. A new game engine that could add online multiplayer was the original plan, but as Andy went off to create Reinforcements and the director's cut, another team went off and started working on the first true, proper sequel, still using Andy's expansions as the basis for the new game. On top of that, by this point, Team 17 believed that the pixelated look of Worms was one of the key reasons more gamers were not jumping on board, so they decided to add SVGA graphics to better enhance the characters and to obviously attract a larger audience.
I think the predominant inspiration was from slapstick cartoons, in particular Ren and Stimpy. We did a lot of tests and went for a completely madcap style, but in the end it had to be calmed down somewhat in order just to pull the whole thing off.
And really, besides the animated style and online gameplay, there really isn't much to say. Worms 2, which found its way onto systems in 1997, was yet again an extremely highly rated game. With its new art style and new user interface, the game became a lot easier for newcomers to the series. And I personally remember a lot of friends that hadn't previously played any Worms games inviting me to play this game. It had found a new audience. The aim was to get it in front of as many people as possible, and it succeeded. As well as being a game very much made for newcomers, hardcore fans were still able to get a kick out of the customizations, including a level editor and random level generator for endless Worms fun. Here's Martin Brown explaining some of the ideas that they had for the sequel that ended up getting scrapped.
At the start of the project, we had a huge list of really cool ideas for the game, especially based around weapons, interactive objects, and additional things the Worms would or could do, etc. As a lot of these were tried, we found out that a lot of the time, the ideas just didn't really gel or felt out of place, so a lot of it was dropped and rethought out. A good example are interactive objects such as boulders that could be dislodged and moved around the landscape. They just didn't work well in the game and were removed. Another newbie was dynamic water, where we could generate an object full of live water, either in an object or as a pool, whatever. When dislodged, this would ebb, flow, and settle on the landscape, either carrying worms with it or draining into the ocean. At the moment, the code is quite slow, as it hasn't been fully optimized. Until we are confident that it works well, rather than an excuse for a new feature, we aren't including it. As a byproduct, a whole set of animations for worm swimming has been done, including all the things like breathing, bubbles and splashes, etc. The idea all depends on the technical compromises that have to be made, as animating water in real time like that takes a lot of processing time. The water is good because it also affects weapons, so a dynamite thrown into a pool that a worm is in extinguishes, but a sodium bomb would explode violently.
It may look like yet another slight upgrade, and I mean, it technically was, but at the same time you can see plenty of changes here, primarily with its art style that became the standard moving forward in this, the first game of the second generation of Worms titles. Bringing us to the second game of the second generation, the fan favourite Worms Armageddon. Wormageddon, as it was originally known during production, before being changed due to Team 17 saying the name was too similar to Carmageddon, was unsurprisingly originally going to be an expansion of Worms 2. But after Andy suggested that they add even more to the game, it was eventually evolved into a standalone title, and this is that standalone title. Also, it was supposed to be the final ever Worms game. Here's an interview with Andy from Team 17's own website via the Wayback Machine.
Worms Armageddon is the ultimate in Worms gameplay, the last and final chapter of an amazing saga. But is this really the end as we know it?
With Worms Armageddon, the game has basically gone as far as it can go. There's no point producing a sequel to a game if it doesn't add something worthwhile or improve the game as a whole. You only end up alienating the fans of the game. Better to leave things on a high.
I'm pretty sure the runtime of this video has showcased how inaccurate that statement was. Anyway, Worms Armageddon was the full package. To many, this was and still is the best game in the series. So much so that it received official updates well into the 2010s and, in a way, came back in a big way, right at the tail end of the series. But more on that as we get to it. But for now, even though I myself at the time had felt a little burnt out on the series, ignoring this, one of the best entries for many a year, to the hardcore fan, the single player mode was the best it's ever been, with puzzles and training to boot. And the online matches, well, they were perfect. They were quick, they were easy to get into, and if there really is anything to take from this, the fourth game in 4 years, not including the expansions and re-releases, is that it really did push the online concepts of Worms to new heights. And at the end of the day, that's when this franchise is at its best, when played in multiplayer. Yes, it had new scenarios, new customizations and weapons and all that jargon, but online multiplayer was never this good, thanks to Team 17's multiplayer internet service called WormNet. A fitting ending for a franchise that had started to take over Team 17. In fact, if you go back to the very first Worms, Team 17 had put out 8 games, and exactly half of those games up to this point were Worms games of some sort. Not only was I filled up to the brim with all of this, but so was Andy. Turns out that he was well underway with designing his new game, telling people that
I'm now concentrating totally on the next game. This takes the philosophy behind Worms and introduces it into a whole new game. Watch this space.
But unfortunately, whatever that game was, we never got to see it, as Team 17 decided not to move forward with the new idea, but instead made Worms World Party, which was pretty much Armageddon 1.5. But then again, wasn't Armageddon Worms 2 1.5? Whatever. The whole reason that this game exists is because of Sega. They had come along and asked Team 17 to make a Worms game for the Dreamcast, which was heavily pushing the online play thing at the time. And I've got to admit, this was when I jumped back into Worms briefly. I've got to say, playing Worms online via the Dreamcast was incredible. At the time, we lived in a pub/hotel, and yes, I would secretly swap out the phone line in order to play games like this, among others. So, Mum, if you're watching, apologies for all of the bookings I no doubt lost you. The reason I loved Worms World Party so much was because I had had a break from the series. To the hardcore fans, this was trying to add just too much to an already perfected formula in Armageddon. It really does depend on who you ask, quite frankly. Either way, the important thing to point out here was that Andy had gone. Worms World Party was the first mainline game that he hadn't worked on. He had already said in official Team 17 interviews that he didn't want to make more Worms games, yet here we are, more Worms games with Worms World Party, yet another Worms game that was released the same year as Online Worms, a free downloadable Korean PC version of the game. Both of these entries came in a year after Worms Pinball, the first Worms spin-off game, a game that featured one table and was a port of Team 17's Addiction Pinball. I mean, it's fine, it's pinball, like I said, it's fine. It doesn't really have much of anything to do with the franchise besides the name, as you would expect, which is the same as Worms Blast that came out a year after Worms World Party and put our wormy friends in a sort of bubble setting because, hey, why not? Actually, you know what? I'm not gonna fob this one off. Imagine Bubble Bobble, but with you shooting down the colours using those typical gravity-heavy weapons typical to the series. It actually makes total sense. The game has plenty of puzzles and what have you for single players, but unsurprisingly, it's multiplayer where the game really does shine. It's surprisingly really good. It's also dirt cheap, and if you ask me, it's a cool little diversion for the series. At least they didn't make a kart racer, am I right? Well, yeah, actually they almost did. Worms Battle Rally was going to be a kart racer with a heavy emphasis on taking down your opponents. I mean, I guess a Mario Kart-like battle mode with Worms makes way more sense than it does in Mario Kart. Regardless, it was cancelled. and so was Team 17, in the eyes of Andy at least. Thankfully for him, a contract was signed that allowed him to earn royalties from the franchise as he moved on to ventures new. It's a double-edged sword, I suppose. He wanted the company to move away and make new games, but at the same time, considering the company were putting out multiple Worms games every single year for different consoles, I bet those royalty checks were quite tasty.
I wanted to take risks and ensure any sequel offered something significant over its predecessors. One of the things I'd wanted to try was giving it a proper real-time one-player game. This was supposed to be part of Worms Armageddon, but we were never given the go-ahead to do a prototype to see how well it would have worked. I'd seen so many games I'd loved in the past devalued by sequels for the sake of sequels that I didn't want that happening here. However, it seemed like this was going to be the direction the series would go in from there. I'd been working on ideas for a completely different game, but I wasn't given the go-ahead to develop that further either. So it was at that point that I decided to leave. Walking away from it all was just one of the hardest decisions I've had to make, but I just wasn't achieving what I wanted there.
So, Andy was gone, which leaves us with one final game from the second generation of Worms, which came in 2002, as Korea got another exclusive port originally called Worms Plus Aqua, before being renamed to Worms World Party Aqua. This, just like Worms Online, was an online-only game that has long gone the way of the worm, I suppose, and featured very little that made it unique. M-Game, the developer who made this, basically took what they thought were the best bits from the second generation, and that was the end of that. Let's move in to the third generation, shall we? Nope, not yet. Because before all of that, we had 2003's Worms 3D, which of course kicked off the 3D generation. Now, the idea of putting Worms into a 3D space is one of those catch-22 things. Nowadays, most people scoff at the idea of playing Worms in anything but 2D, but back then, I personally remember friends of mine being extremely excited about playing the game in 3D. It was a different time, a time that upon reflection really does show how incredible the gameplay is of these games. 2D games weren't mainstream, we were still in the fill it up with polygons or go home era. It's funny how things have all flipped around now, isn't it? Either way, it doesn't matter, because Worms 3D is, yes, a different way of playing the classic game, but thankfully it's still just as fun if you have the right people in multiplayer. Team 17 have been working on this concept for quite some time, even taking inspiration from Hogs of War, which in turn took inspiration from Worms itself. The problem was, however, the landscape. Team 17 never wanted to create a 3D Worms game where the terrain wasn't properly destructible like the originals. Thankfully, after a lot of trial and error, the team made a new engine that even to this day is quite remarkable, and it helps to make the game become that perfect middle ground between the old and the new. Upon release, reviewers didn't exactly take to the game all that much, the camera being the biggest issue, as you often found your viewpoint being behind the character you're controlling. Not easy when you're trying to aim your weapons. Thankfully, the game did offer several viewpoints to help combat this, but still, many gamers couldn't get past it, Andy included.
This was something I'd always argued against. Worms was built around being a 2D game, and all the game mechanics are designed around that. To just take the game and put it in 3D ends up breaking a lot of those mechanics. I just see it as a bit pointless. I'd rather start again from scratch and build a 3D game with the same qualities as Worms, rather than try and recreate Worms itself.
Regardless of polarising opinions from the fans, it didn't take long for Team 17 to put that engine to good use once again and create yet another Worms game with Worms Forts Under Siege. Now this, out of all the 3D Worms games, tends to be the entry that is mostly forgotten about. However, I'm here to tell you that it may just be the best. Again, depending on the sort of gamer you are. Look, Worms in the 3D space just isn't for everyone. The amount of hurdles that you have to overcome in the 2D games quadruples when you take it into 3D. It's overly complicated and therefore becomes annoying. And this is where Forts comes in. Not a direct sequel per se, more of a spin-off to the 3D series. In this game, you unsurprisingly build forts. You do this to protect your worms, but also to use the turrets that you built in order to take down your opponent's fort. Because of this, it's only really the forts themselves that are destructible, forcing you to focus all of your energy on destroying those. It changes the gameplay more than any other mainline game up to this point, and this is the bulk of what's on offer here. It's a decent choice for those that only want to play in multiplayer. Is it better though? Well, that comes down to each individual user, as the majority of 3D Worms fans actually prefer Worms 4 Mayhem, or to be more specific, its HD re-release that came in 2011. I mean, unsurprisingly, it's more of the same, a refined version of the 3D Worms formula that some love and some hate. Although I bet your bottom dollar that the majority of the haters hardly ever played it. They're still playing Armageddon online. And to be fair, I don't blame them. There really isn't much that needs to be said here. It's Worms, it looks beautiful, the animation, the colour and the backgrounds all fit perfectly with the more cartoony side of the franchise. The destructible landscape is just as important as it ever was in 3D, arguably more so in some cases, and although certain close range attacks may have lost their impact compared to the classics, other weapons are significantly more powerful in these 3D entries, making them feel different. But, you know, also the same. Look, at the end of the day, I'm with 99% of you. I prefer the 2D gameplay, but there's no denying that these are still great releases. Their biggest issue, sadly, is that after a couple of goes, they really just want to make you go back and play the 2D classics, meaning that you're not likely going to give these enough of a chance to learn all of the tactics exclusive to the 3D generation. Also, they were released at a time when the majority of the world was starting to get fed up with Worms video games. It was 3 years since we got the first 3D Worms game, and every year since then we had got another 3D Worms game. Plus golf. I mean, of course there's a bloody golf game, isn't there? Programmed by Rockpool Games for Java mobile phones, this spin-off is, I mean, it's actually okay. Obviously, I'm comparing this to other Java games, which for the most part are terrible. I think it's fair to say that this is to be looked at as a golf game instead of a Worms game. You simply aim and whack your grenade towards the tied up worm who's at the goal, and you gotta do it in as few tries as possible. It's harmless, nothing to get too upset about, especially considering it did well enough to get its own properly developed Team 17 sequel called Worms Crazy Golf. Now this one is really good. You aim, you shoot, and you try to get to the end with as few strikes as possible. And you have all of the hazards like sheep and, well, other worms in your way to hinder or help you along your way. Maybe it's because I wasn't expecting all that much, but I've got to admit, I had a lot of fun with this one. Of course, it's far from a full price game, being sold for a couple of quid on Steam and bundled into most other Worms packs. And for that, it gets the Slope approval stamp. If you end up getting this game as part of a deal, I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at just how addictive it is, especially in local multiplayer, which is where this game series has always shined. And with that, we are now finally about to enter the third generation of Worms games. Back when a generation of gamers were asking for Worms to go back to the way they should have always been played, in 2D. And with the rise of 2D games coming back into fashion thanks to the popularity of handhelds such as the DS and the PSP, we got Open Warfare, a game that should not be played on DS, but is more than worthy on the PSP. Damn, this is a good game. I remember travelling a lot back when this game came out and taking my PSP with me. And no matter how many top tier PSP games I purchased, I kept coming back to Worms Open Warfare. It had been 5 years since a proper 2D entry with Worms World Party, and the game worked perfectly well on this handheld. In fact, it was so well received by longtime fans that it got ported onto the Xbox Live Arcade service and the PlayStation Network. Again, the perfect platforms for a now budget title like this. The original Open Warfare and now the annoyingly titled Worms, just Worms, are essentially HD remakes of the original game from 1995. Yes, it has a backstory, but as always, it's all about the multiplayer. Thankfully, it was released onto the exact right systems at the exact right time when more and more people were getting into playing multiplayer online. Sure, it's more of the same, but it helps bring back interest into retro and indie-like games to these services, proving to the world that the classics are classics for a reason. In fact, this casual Xbox Live Arcade release was so popular that it ended up becoming one of the top 10 XBLA downloads of all time, according to Team 17 themselves. Now, I looked into this myself and I couldn't confirm this, but you just know it's going to be right up there regardless. Handheld gamers continued to be looked after by the company when Open Warfare 2 was released, again for the PSP and the DS, getting above average reviews across the board for both platforms this time. In fact, upon release, it was one of the best versions of the game since the glory days of Armageddon. Everything you could want and expect is found here, and even though it's more of the same, it allowed for yet another way to play the game online on yet another system. Plus, as the game made its way onto handhelds, which are typically used in a single-player fashion, it featured several features such as a puzzle mode and a campaign mode in order to get the most bang for your buck from that market. In other words, it's the same game again with all of the relevant bells and whistles attached, but of course this still makes it a pretty damn good game. Worms Space Oddity, on the other hand, wasn't so great. How do you think it works over at Team 17? A new console comes out and without even thinking if they should, another version of Worms is getting made for it. Worms Space Oddity is the company's attempt at getting the game using motion controls, and surprisingly, it works. Although the biggest issue with it was the fact that the game didn't have any kind of online gameplay, with THQ, the publisher, stating,
"We've chosen to focus on making the best possible local multiplayer experience through fast-paced gameplay and entertaining party games. Players will get even more fun and satisfaction from being able to see the reaction of their friends and taunting them with attacks face to face."
Yeah, whatever. I'm sure it has nothing to do with the shockingly small amount of Wii users playing online video games. Besides Mario Kart, of course. Thankfully, this was resolved with Battle Island, a budget game that not only offered online play, but also the option to not use the Wiimote, if that's what you prefer. However, if you ask me, considering you've got so many ways of playing your bog standard Worms games by this point, playing this one with the Wiimote is actually well worth it. PSP owners also got this version of the game, and the reviews were again good for the budget title. Back over on the Xbox Live Arcade and PlayStation Network, the annoyingly titled Worms game continued to do well numbers-wise, prompting Team 17 to make a sequel called Worms 2 Armageddon, which itself got a remake, or as the company likes to put it, an extended edition for PC under the name Worms Reloaded. Now, this may sound crazy considering we've had so many new Worms games recently. However, this was the first proper 2D Worms game on the PC since Worms World Party. And I think this is how the Worms series has managed to stay relevant for so long. Everybody likes these games. They're fairly easy to make, I assume, and they're easily portable to absolutely everything. So even though it may sound like we have too many games in the series, and let's face it, we kind of do, at the end of the day, each new system normally only gets about 1 or 2 entries, or in the PC's case, a decent length of time between similar games in the series. Either way, by this point, all they really seem to be doing is releasing the same game with even more bells and whistles attached, because surely adding modes like rope racing really does show that this is as far as the series could possibly go. And yeah, it kind of was. The majority of the reviews for these later games were all incredibly high, with the only real negative being, yeah, it's good, but it's just Worms. Again. And even though the game series was still selling well enough, earning a good amount of moolah for the company, and Andy of course, the hardcore fans were still going back to play Armageddon, the perfect middle ground for the series. New enough to not look pixelated, but not so desperate that they're forced to add something like, well, again, rope racing. It was time to cater to the hardcore.
This is a public information film, or if you're common, film. Be on the lookout for these 4 worms: Soldier, Scout, Scientist, and Heavy. They are highly dangerous and extensively trained in the art of brutal combat and vicious one-upmanship.
Worms Revolution took the series in an entirely new and fresh direction. Not only have we got a new art style that, if you ask me, may just be the best in the series, but most importantly, you got the physics. Yes, physics have always been a part of all Worms games, but here they're turned all the way up to 11. In Revolution, when you shoot open large bodies of water, unlike previous entries where it would just make a crater, now you can actually use the water to wash away your enemies. Which, if you remember, was actually something they wanted to do since Worms 2. On top of that, you also have the ability to pick up objects and move them around for extra damage or coverage. These small changes mix up the Worm formula significantly, and instead of adding a stupid amount of weapons on top of everything else in this title, your Worms have also been given classes. Now, at first glance, the idea of something like this may put you off, but the more you play of it, the more you realise just how cool this idea was. For the time. Soldiers are essentially your classic Worms. Scientists are used to give all of your teammates an extra 5 health points per round that he is alive, as well as providing the odd weapon upgrade too. Scouts, as you would expect, are used to scout about. Why would you need to do this when you can explore the full map already? Well, it's mostly for weapon pickups. Plus, half the size means that he can use jetpacks for twice as long as the average worm, and when he drills into the earth, due to his size, it means that the enemies can't use the same sized hole to get to your base. And then of course you got the heavies, slower worms that offer the biggest punch with the standard weapon like bazookas and grenades. This class system really does mix up the formula and then some. The only problem with this is that the majority of players would eventually work out what collection of the worm classes would work best for them, and then just stick with it. But of course, only after they've worked all of that out. And getting to that point is still obvious Worms fun. Maybe it's me getting completely wormed out making a video like this, but I personally cannot suggest this entry enough. It has such a unique and, more importantly, a fresh style. Is it better? Well, that is down to your own personal preference. I definitely still prefer the standard way of playing, but I can't deny I enjoy picking this one up from time to time, to try something new in a series where 95% of the entries feel like DLC. Speaking of DLC, this entry had a load of it. Thankfully, all of that was packaged together in the Vita release and the Xbox 360 physical release alongside Worms 2 Armageddon and all of its DLC too. Worms 3 might as well be DLC, not to be confused with Worms 3D, which went under the name Worms 3 during production. This game is called Worms 3 because it's the third Worms game for iOS. See what I mean by each platform only really getting a few entries? As this is a mobile game, expect it to play like your typical entry with very few extras added. In fact, the water physics that made Revolution feel so unique are all missing here. This is simply nothing more than Worms again for the third time on mobiles. Worms Clan Wars, on the other hand, took what Revolution set out to do and, well, it did more. Most hardcore fans still preferred to play the simple yet brilliant Armageddon, but Clan Wars was Team 17's attempt to merge the feel of that game with the new physics engine. On top of that, as the title suggests, the development team pushed hard to make this more multiplayer focused than ever before, by adding clans to the mix with crazy amounts of customizations to boot. Add all of this with the companion app for your phone and you've got something that truly is designed for the hardcore Worms fan. In other words, it's just Worms Revolution 1.5, which makes Worms Battleground 1.6? How many times can one company release the same game? Yeah, you have a mix of both Revolution and Clan Wars here, but beyond that, practically nothing extra to shout about, besides some minor refinements that only the true hardcore fan will ever notice. I struggle to think of any developer out there that has put this many games out of what is essentially the exact same game. Thankfully, we did get another spin-off in 2014 with Flockers. I had no idea this game existed, and it's such a cool idea that sadly seems to have been completely forgotten about. So the game starts off with you seeing the factory where they make the crates you find in the Worms games. As you know, the sheep are constantly used throughout the series, and they have had enough. In Flockers, the sheep are trying to escape the factory when 9 times out of 10, they'll meet their bloody end. Seriously, this is by far the most gruesome game in the Worms franchise. It's essentially Lemmings, but with the sheep from the Worms games. So of course, this plays nothing like the original games. It's a new type of puzzle game and it works really bloody well. With that said, it's far from a new idea, but the setting, the look and the atmosphere fully makes it stand on its own 2 feet. It's a shame that more people do not know about this entry, as it really is quite fun and way more gruesome than you would expect. Either way, it's still on Steam and I cannot suggest checking it out enough. Anyway, time for more Worms with Worms 4. Not to be confused with Worms 4 Mayhem, this is the 4th Worms game for mobile phones. Weirdly, this entry only gives us 3 worms per team, as opposed to 4. And, well, besides this, would you believe me if I told you it was more of the same game, but with a slightly different art style? Because it is. Reviews for the game tend to be mixed up between super good and super average. The super good are from the long-time fans that haven't played a game in a while, screaming that, I remember this! It's still great because it's Worms, again! And the super average reviews saying something like, yeah, it's good, but come on, it's Worms, again! It's fair to say that Team 17 had squeezed possibly a bit too much out of this generation. And look, even though I'm a massive fan of the physics-based engine found in some of the titles from this generation, there's no denying that with the classes and the physics engine, that they have moved possibly a bit too far away from the classic engine that was perfected with Worms Armageddon and Worms World Party. In fact, Armageddon was still being played online, a considerable amount. Because of this, Kevin Carthew, the creative director of the Worms franchise, decided that for the next big entry, they had to take it back to its roots. Not only was a new entry style needed in order to make the game feel fresh as usual, but the most important piece of the worm pie was to make it feel like Armageddon. The perfect game with the perfect ninja rope physics and a near perfect roster of weapons that works well with the classic formula. And that's exactly what they did. Worms WMD, which is believed to stand for Weapons of Mass Destruction, is a game that, if you ask me, is the best the series has ever made. which is good because it's the most recent game too. Well, okay, it's the last proper game at least. Vehicles and gun turrets are all available to our wormy friends in this outing, inspired by Metal Slug, in case you were wondering. And you even have the ability to hide inside buildings, which brings a whole new level of strategy when playing online. On top of that, the random level generator, which has always been a core selling point for the series, was changed for the first time here. Instead of landscapes essentially being randomly drawn lines with a standard loop texture inside, in order to get Worms WMD to keep its hand-drawn style, the team decided to create a crazy amount of small props that would then be randomly stitched together in order to keep that style. This, alongside the new Worm art style itself, which took quite a bit of time to get right, before ending on a character that took inspiration from popular kids shows at the time, like Nickelodeon's Tough Puppy, ended up being the perfect mix. And the obvious reason for this was because Worms Armageddon was used as the basis for this game. In fact, the team went as far as to closely look at the source code for that game to work out why it was just so damn popular, literally taking the secret source and rebuilding it from scratch. The end result, again, was a highly respected game with an excellent score across the board. And even though many hardcore fans still keep going back to play Armageddon, for me and many others, this was finally the sequel that we had waited all those years to finally get. Also, I just love that nobody actually knows what WMD truly stands for. And that's where we are. WMD was released back in 2016 and, as stated, is the last proper Worms game. 2002 saw the series' latest spin-off called Worms Rumble, which removes pretty much everything that's iconic to the series as they tried to shoehorn Worms into the overpopulated world of battle royale games with average results. But I think it's fair to say that no matter how much they throw at the wall, it's the original idea from Andy Davidson that's still at the heart of every single great entry. And as we get closer to the 30th anniversary of the franchise, with endless amounts of matches being played every second of every day, I think it's fair to say that Worms is a true classic that's here to stay. A franchise that came close to death when that no longer so small indie studio pumped out as much as they possibly could. Possibly too much if you ask me. But then again, they did sell over 65 million copies of Worms games collectively. Most other franchises would have been killed off due to this repetition, but not Worms. Yes, it did get a tad too heavy, but for the most part, reviews were all still well above average for the mainline releases. And considering you've had a new game pretty much every year since the original, I think it goes to show just how powerful this series is. There's something about Worms that continues to pull people in. A true evergreen game franchise that's finally having a bit of a break release-wise, even if the fans are not. There you have it, guys. Worms: The Complete History. This one has taken an extremely long time to make, as you can imagine, but yeah, thank you guys so much if you've made it this far. I mean, this is like an hour-long video, so thank you so much. But yeah, this is the part of the video I'd like to give a massive shout out to all of the Patreons, all of the YouTube supporters that support me every single month and allow me to make videos like this pretty frequently. So let's give a massive shout out to those people, with an extra big shout out going to the following: the Boots and Pup, the Sneaky Ferret, Vita Savanes, James, the Action Saxon, Roll VP, Jay is Manchild, Clan Bob, Mike Fallon, Nicholas Burtner, Chev Matic, Jabba Al Aiden, Benjamin Guy, Richard Alderjic, Shadow Dragon, Dina, Ye Old Hamburglar, Jeff Mianowski, Bram Perez, Conrad Constantine, Andrew Dalton, Retro to Next Gen, aka Lou, Paul Float, Ryan Burford, Casey Samples, VPS Data, Sir Nilsson, Derek Kuda, Akatimo84, John Rogers, Matt Jackson, Ian Quell, Arista, Dina81, Mind of the Unsane, and Vike Echo. Thank you to all of you people so much for your support. If you guys want to get your name shown down below, get your name shouted out, and see all of the exclusive videos behind the scenes in the password zone, then please do consider becoming a Patreon and YouTube member yourself. It really does support the show, but otherwise, just a simple like, a comment, subscribe, all that stuff. You know the drill. Anyway, guys, it's DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.